All right, I think it is time to start. Let me introduce myself. My name is Petr Kopecký, and I'll moderate this webinar. The webinar that, as you know, is titled Studying the Environment in and the Humanities, US in the Spotlight. And first of all, I'd like to say that I'm glad that you have not lost interest in this topic over the past week, and apologies for the technical difficulties that we encountered a week ago. It's definitely an honor to be part of this project, which is actually titled Climate Walk. And I have to say that for American literature people, walking associates a very important essay written by Henry David Thoreau, because it's one of the sources of American environmental thought. And Thoreau actually calls walking slaughtering in this remarkable essay derived from Santerre, Holy Land. So for Thoreau, walking is not only a physical exercise, but also a mental and a spiritual one. So I wish those on their way across the continent, across Europe, lots of discoveries and epiphanies. My task now is to walk you through the program, which you were able to see a minute ago on the title page. So what you can expect is 4 presentations, all of them given by my colleagues from the English department, Faculty of Arts, University of Ostrava. Their names, as well as the titles of the presentations, were given on the title page in the order in which they will be presented. You can actually see 2 of my colleagues on the screen, Parisa, Changizi, and Karla, Rohová, and the last speaker, Beneš, will join us a little bit later because he's still teaching, actually. Before you hear the first presentation, I'd like to say a few technicalities. First of all, this webinar, as you may have noticed already, is being recorded. I'd like to ask you to kindly switch your cameras off, if possible. It's not that I don't want to see your faces, but it has to do with a connection, as you know. The tentative schedule of this webinar is, we are giving it 9 minutes, but we are ready to stay longer. So if you have lots of questions, we will definitely stay and we'll be ready to respond if we can. And speaking of the questions, I'd like you to use the chat box for questions. Just make sure that you send a question to everyone, not just a single person. And we will do our best to address these questions once we are done with all the 4 presentations. And if you want to, let's say, phrase your question verbally, you can raise your hand virtually. When you click on participant, you got options, and one of them is raise hand, so you can use that as well. We'll first address those questions in the chat box, and then we will deal with the questions that you ask after raising your hand. So, first of all, as I said, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, a PhD at the English department, my first PhD student. But the interesting thing about Parisa Changizi is that she already has a PhD. So she's doing her second PhD in Ostrava. Her first PhD comes from the University of Shiraz in Iran. And her dissertation actually dealt with Margaret Atwood. It was actually an ecocritical study of selected works of Margaret Atwood. And I dare say that Parisa Changizi is an accomplished scholar, an ecocritical scholar. And I think that she's best qualified to introduce you to the field, which means ecocriticism, as well as environmental humanities. So I think I can invite Parisa to share her screen. So go ahead, please.
So I'm hoping that everyone can see my screen. Okay, so hello everyone. As Dr. Kopecký already mentioned, I'm going to start off this session by doing a very short introduction. First, I'm going to very briefly define environmental humanities, and then later on, for the most part in my presentation, I'm going to focus on ecocriticism. First, I'm going to define it, and then we're going to talk about why it developed and how it developed towards the end of the 20th century. And at the end, we're going to talk about the kinds of texts ecocritics would actually study. And later on, my colleagues would actually offer ecocritical readings of some actual texts, so you would know basically how exactly it's done. So let's see, environmental humanities is an interdisciplinary field that brings the social sciences, the humanities, and natural sciences together. And basically the central idea here is that the understanding of environmental issues that we are facing today actually must include insights from humanities, social sciences, and literary studies specifically. This understanding of these issues cannot be only relevant to natural sciences, civil engineering, law, public policy, and so on and so forth. And ecocriticism actually, as a field of literary studies, actually embraced this central idea, and we can actually argue that ecocriticism is a part of this obviously very broad interdisciplinary enterprise that nowadays we know as environmental humanities. So what is this ecocriticism? In very brief sort of definition I can give you is that ecocriticism is a sort of a earth-centered approach to literary studies. Obviously, environment and description of environment has always been part and parcel of literary works and analyses. But what happened towards the end of the 20th century was a shift in perspective, in the sense that environment became more central in the analyses, and also no longer people saw environment as a sort of a mere backdrop to human action. And this sort of shift in perspective actually gave birth to this field of literary study that nowadays we know as ecocriticism. So in ecocriticism, people are very much concerned about the representation of nature, and and also the relationship that exists between human beings and the physical environment around them. To give you a very, I would say, simple example, I have two paintings here, and if you look at these two paintings, we can actually, talk about the sort of thing that ecocritics are actually interested in when they are studying literary texts. In the first painting, as you can see, we have a portrayal of nature, a sort of representation of nature. Nature is represented as something beautiful, sublime, even a little bit menacing and dangerous. On the other hand, a human being that you can see at the center of the painting, he has a very dominant presence, I would say, and he has a very, I would say, different sort of relationship with the environment than this person in the second painting. In the second painting, as you can see, again, we have the representation of nature, but the person or the human being is actually very hard, I would say, to actually see him at the first glance, but he's very small and he seems to be actually kneeling a little bit. So very different sort of, obviously, representation of the relationship between human beings and nature. And obviously the arguments that you can see from ecocritics nowadays is not that simple. They basically present their arguments in very much more complicated and decorated language and fancy language. And it's enmeshed in a theoretical framework, but at the very core of it, that's what we are interested in. To give you some sort of idea how ecocriticism basically developed, critics have identified so far 4 waves of ecocriticism. Today, I'm going to just talk about the first wave and the second wave to give you some sort of idea how it developed. As far as the first wave is concerned, the critics were mostly preoccupied with the representation of nature and wilderness, and obviously nature writing and non-fiction. And they had some sort of a anti-theoretical spirit, I would say. They were very much skeptical of postmodernism. because of its linguistic turn, in the sense that postmodernism believed that everything is basically constructed by language, and they saw that as a sort of a denial of something real out there, which is the physical environment. And what happened with the second wave, first of all, they started to be a little bit more interested in critical theory, because they wanted some sort of mode of expression, and that was lacking obviously in the first wave. And also they started to be no longer interested solely in the romanticization of wilderness and nature. So they actually somehow directed themselves and their attention toward sites of environmental devastation. And last but not least, they started to be more focused on social issues. They wanted to study the impact of race, class, gender, and sexuality on how we use and abuse nature. And so many of the trends that are fashionable today in ecocritical readings, I would say, have their foundation basically in the second wave ecocriticism. And to give you some sort of timeline, the early origins of ecological literary studies goes back to the 60s and 70s, but it actually became a recognizable critical school in the 1990s. And here I have the cover of Time magazine. And instead of having the person of the year who has done the most basically to influence the events of the year, in 1989 they decided to nominate Endangered Earth as the planet of the year, instead of the person of the year, right? And to give you some sort of idea how big of a shift it was for people, I have here a quotation from an essay entitled Nature by Emerson, who was an American writer and transcendentalist. And what he's actually trying to do, and this essay actually was published in the first half of the 19th century, I think it was the year 1836, if I'm not mistaken. And what he's trying to do here is that he wants to define nature versus art. So what is considered to be natural and what is considered to be artificial or man-made. And his basic argument is that, the operations of mankind, whatever we do, is so small and so insignificant that, a little chipping and baking and patching and washing that we are doing here and there wouldn't change this grand nature that we have. This sort of optimism that you actually can see with regard to the capabilities of the natural environment around us was some sort of idea which flourished in the first half of the 19th century, when Industrial Revolution, relatively speaking, was in earliest stages. So the perspective of a late 20th century individual, or the perspective of 21st century individual, would be drastically different, because with all the technological advances that we have today, we actually nowadays know that we can do a lot, and we can do a lot of damage to the environment. Atomic bomb would be a very good example. So basically, the argument here is that all these environmental issues that we have today, you name it, deforestation, toxic waste, endangered species, consumerism, population growth, nuclear waste, climate change, all of that have become an integral part of 21st century experience and imagination. And that's why ecocritical studies are very interesting, and I do believe important nowadays. And as far as ecocritical, ecologically informed literary studies are concerned, the basic argument here for us is that ecocriticism can actually answer some very important questions, hopefully. For example, it can perhaps explain why we believe the way we do, and by doing so demonstrate how things can be different from what they are. Obviously, very cautiously, that's something that has to be done. The basic idea is that if you know the disease, then probably you can know the cure better. And this actually goes back to the central idea that I explained first, that it is the responsibility of basically all human sciences, and not just ecology or law or public policy, to deal with environmental issues. And as far as the texts that ecocritics are concerned, obviously, as I mentioned, at first people were very much interested in their traditional archive of American and British nature writing and poetry, and environmentally oriented nonfiction. But very quickly they realized that's not adequate, so they actually expanded their boundaries. And nowadays you have ecocritical studies of texts that go back as far as the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest text that is available to us, literary works of canonical authors such as Shakespeare, and of course works that were produced outside of Anglo-American role. And this is something which is very much fashionable these days. And this might come as a good news to many of you, that ecocriticism has actually moved beyond the scope of literature. Nowadays, critics are doing readings of movies, visual media, advertisement, music, ecocritical readings of hip-hop music, photography, and so on and so forth. So basically, whatever you're interested in, you can do. You can study them from ecocritical lens. So I'm actually done with the presentation, and I'm going to finish this presentation by posing a very, I would say, important and challenging question that I do believe, and it seems, that rests at the very core of ecocritical studies. And that question is, how can we lead a good life? How can we reach that sort of harmony or harmonious relationship with our environment? How can we have a sort of a prosperous, convenient life without doing too much damage, irreversible ones, to our natural environment? So I'm going to leave you with that question and let my colleague take over. And thank you for listening.
All right. Thank you for your presentation, Parisa. So I'm taking over as you invited me. So thanks for this really concise and useful overview of the main ideas, concepts, and issues, because that overview will serve us really well. So now it's up to me to talk about something that's, let's say, more focused, and this something is called Californian literature and environmentalism. Let me first say one or two sentences about me. My scholarly interest in ecocriticism dates back to my Fulbright mission in California at San Jose State University between 2003 and 2004, where my research was centered around Californian literature and deep ecology, or non-anthropocentric thought, and I will address that in my presentation. So hopefully you will be able to learn a little bit more in the presentation. So let me just share the screen with you. So the title, I believe, is self-explanatory, and to start with, I want to introduce my hypothesis and the structure of the presentation. So what I'll argue for is expressed in the hypothesis. So my argument is that Californian writing informs and inspires environmentalist thought as well as action. Sorry about that. And what you can expect in my presentation is a bit about Rachel Carson, a very important figure, not Californian though. And then the focus will shift to California. I'll talk about different forms or kinds of environmentalism or environmental movement, preservation movement, modern environmentalism, which means second half of the 20th century, basically, radical environmentalism, and then I'll try and present what I see as a distinctive literary stream or current within California literature. And I'll also briefly touch on environmental utopia and dystopia in California literature. So before I focus on California, I want to mention perhaps the most important book related to environmentalism. The book in question is called Silent Spring. The author is Rachel Carson, and this book that was published in 1962 actually triggered a huge wave of environmentalism in the United States of America that swept across the whole country, across the whole nation. California, which, as some of you may know, is a leading state on environmental issues in the American context, can arguably pride in having really a huge number of writers who have voiced environmental concerns and promoted environmental consciousness. So I'll focus on California. First of all, I should say that California is very often described as a laboratory when it comes to social as well as natural processes. The common attributes that even scholars use about California, you can see here: pioneer or pioneering, cutting edge, forefront, trendsetting or trendsetter. What's also important in this connection is that climate change demonstrates in various ways in California, and definitely more visibly in some other parts of both the US and the world. So I'm giving a couple of examples in the brackets. So we have floods, heat waves, forest fires. Probably you have noticed in the past years that it makes the headlines even in European or Czech media. Droughts as well as landslides. So therefore, it's no wonder that nature writing represents an important and quite prominent genre in California literature. So the destruction of the California environment does provoke literary responses and many creative writers. So they either lament the decimation, the destruction of the environment, or offer like alternatives. So as I say, imaginative accounts of alternative societies, environmentally sustainable. Here I got a quote from Charlene Spretnak, who is a very important noted figure in green politics, environmentalism. She's the author of a book that's called Green Politics, actually. And Charlene Spretnak, when she was once introducing Gary Snyder, an important poet I'm going to talk about, in the 1980s, she, of course, did her homework and read his poetry. And this is what she concluded. This is pretty interesting stuff, but these ideas and ways of thinking are in the air these days, so perhaps they are not so original. The thing is that she then looked at the dates of publication of those poems, and it said it was 1950s and 1960s, and that kind of changed her view. And later, as I say, she realized that these ideas, or that some of the most important ideas and insightful ideas about nature and culture and spirituality, about how we live and how we might think about living, are indeed in the air these days, because Gary Snyder helped to put them there. But it was not only Gary Snyder who helped put these ideas in the air. So I'll talk about many other Californian writers who also did a similar job. So I got 2 slides on preservation movement, which you might understand basically as a precursor to what we call environmental movement. And to put things into context, I really want to briefly talk about westering, which is basically the process in which the American frontier, the colonization of the continent, shifted from the east coast of North America to the west coast of today's United States of America, which took many decades and centuries, in fact. And in the process, the natural resources, especially forests, were seen as actually limitless. But only once the Pacific coast, meaning also the Californian coast, on the west coast of the United States was hit, the realization came that the resources were actually finite, that there were limits to the growth and to the expansion. So the finality of the coastline was an important realization or awareness, which actually then led to even the the establishment of the first preservation movements or environmental movements, most importantly, the Sierra Club in the early 1890s, but also to the establishment of the first national parks in the United States of America. So you see that the timing is not coincidental here. Both the establishment of the national parks and the Sierra Club in San Francisco, California, are very closely associated to John Muir, the first president of the Sierra Club, who is also an accomplished writer. So it was very much his literary skills and dozens, if not hundreds of his articles published in the national periodicals, where he employed his literary skills and convinced people of the importance of preservation or protection of the environment and the national parks. What I believe is important here is the biblical terms that he actually used to do that. Because his target audience, after all, was Americans, at that time even more religious people than today. So the biblical frame was important. In a few examples given in the brackets here. What helps too is something that's really visualized in the picture on the right side of the slide, and that's a picture where you can see John Muir on the right and President Theodore Roosevelt on the left. Yes, I mean, Muir took Roosevelt on a hiking trip to Yosemite National Park, spent 3 days bivouacking, and at that time he convinced him of the importance of preservation, the national parks, and so on. So yeah, the importance with leading politicians of the time was important not only when it comes to John Muir, but also Mary Austin, another writer I want to talk about, whom you can see in this picture. Today, she's seen as a pioneering figure in ecofeminism. It was not the way she was called back then. But what's definitely true about her is that her writing is both ecologically or scientifically informed or shaped, if you want, but at the same time, it does have an appeal, emotional appeal, and certain lyrical or lyric characteristics of beauty that has to do with her style. By the way, Austin was also one of the first, if not the very first people who talked about what might be called watershed consciousness in her book The Four, but also in her masterpiece, The Land of Little Rain, set in the Dead Valley of California, where there are chapters called Water Borders or Other Water Borders, where she basically expresses or formulates the concept that is today described as bioregionalism. Long story short, it suggests that the administrative or political borders should not prevail, but we should more stick with the natural borders that define regions. This is especially important when it comes to the American West. If you look at a map, I mean, you see that lots of the borders or frontiers between the individual states of the Union are just straight lines, which don't respect the terrain, the geography of the country at all. So perhaps that kind of insight makes more sense in the American West than elsewhere. What Austin also managed to do was that she offered a very new and innovative perspective on the desert environment of especially Southern California, pointed out the richness of that terrain, of that environment, at a time when desert was seen as a place associated with desolation, carrying very negative connotations, being used as a rather negative image. But with the knowledge that she gathered in the contact with native people at the time, because she was also quite a qualified anthropologist, but also knowledge from the field of evolutionary biology, in which she was very much competent. These two combined made her competent to write a book in which she, again, portrayed the environment, represented the desert in a very positive way, and showing the richness of life and diversity of life that was hidden to most of the people, because much of it was underground. Well, let's now move a little bit to the second half of the 20th century and talk about modern environmentalism, which we associate with Rachel Carson also, that was mentioned at the start. But here I want to talk about Robinson Jeffers, a poet who, by the way, was immensely popular also in the Czechoslovakia of the 1960s. And however, he's also a great source of inspiration for lots of environmental thinkers as well as of environmental activists. For instance, in one seminal work of environmental philosophy, Ivan Janík cites Jeffers' poem "The Answer," in which he, as I say, he celebrates the organic wholeness, not man apart from that. And as you can see, "Not Man Apart" is used as a title on the book, whose cover you can see on the right. And the book was published by the Sierra Club, mentioned earlier, that was started by John Muir in the late 19th century. But it grew in importance in the 1960s at a time of this huge growth of environmentalism in the United States of America. And this book played quite an important role in that, because it became a bestseller. So it is photographs by Ansel Adams, a very well-known landscape photographer, accompanied by poems by Robinson Jeffers. And this "Non-Man Apart" is really something that can be compared to a motto, slogan, or a buzzword that was used once again by environmental thinkers as well as environmental activists, as I'll try to briefly document on the following slide. David Bauer actually founded another organization, another well-known environmental organization that's called Friends of the Earth. And immediately he started editing a newsletter of the organization, which, funnily enough, was called "Not Men Apart," once again. And many other thinkers, such as Arne Naess, a big name in environmental philosophy, environmental thought, a very well-known Norwegian philosopher, iconic figure of Norwegian, let's say, thinking, not only about the environment, very much realized that writers, as I say, capture the essence of deep ecology and, let's say, non-anthropocentric thinking, intuitions, and feelings. So Naess, like many other thinkers, turned to literature for the most cogent and eloquent expressions of the ideas that they wanted to communicate in their texts. And Naess, as well as Brouwer, drew heavily from Jeffers' poetry. Actually, Naess spent quite a lot of time in California as a scholar at UC Berkeley. What I'm trying to say by including the pictures in the presentation is that Jeffers was an immensely popular writer of his time, because otherwise he wouldn't make it to the cover of a very popular magazine called Time in 1932. So he was one of the most famous and popular poets in the United States of the 1920s and 1930s. Huxley and Steinbeck. You might be surprised to see the name of Aldous Huxley, because you may think of him as a British writer. You may not know that he spent half of his life in California, the second half of his life. So Brave New World is not the only thing that he wrote. While in California, his work took on a kind of environmental dimension. He wrote even some environmental utopias while in California, and provided like a lot of inspiration for environmentalists. Perhaps most importantly, a text by Lynn White, written by 1967, which resonated with lots of environmental thinkers and was quoted since then in the most important works of environmental philosophy and environmental history. The essay in question is called "The Historical Roots of Our Ecology Crisis." And it actually, interestingly enough, it opens with Aldous Huxley and his critique of the unnatural treatment of nature. Huxley is used by other writers in a similar spirit. And yeah, it should be said that Huxley comes from a very prominent Huxley family, which is associated especially with evolutionary biology. So Thomas Huxley, Julian Huxley are names that you may have come across. And Steinbeck yeah, what you see there is also a name of one remarkable book on Steinbeck and the environment. The thing is, we associate him with social issues, but today we know that he is also very inspirational when it comes to environmental thinking. And actually, one thing that he said in his letters that I came across is that towards the end of his letter, he said the one book he wished he had written was Silent Spring. So he was kind of envious, full of envy, because yeah, that was exactly the kind of book he wished to write, but he didn't manage. Silent Spring that I started with. When it comes to Gary Snyder, a poet who is associated with the Beat generation, here in the picture, along with Lawrence Ferlinghetti. You may have read about Ferlinghetti. He deceased a few weeks ago. Yet another author who is quite important when it comes to environmental literature. And what I say here on this slide, that actually Snyder was an important inspiration for the person who helped disseminate the ideas of non-anthropocentrism and deep ecology in the United States of America. So Snyder was an important inspiration and mentor to Sessions, but other people, especially in the 1960s. And yeah, it was because of anthropological thinking, bioregional information that is included in his work. And Sessions actually argues that, once again, that ecological consciousness seems most vibrant in the poetic mode. That is also why Snyder won the, let's say, the title of the unofficial poet or laureate of deep ecology, which is a title that is being used by many eco-critics concerning Gary Snyder. Gary Snyder was also important when it comes to radical environmentalism in the United States. So Dave Foreman is probably the most important name when it comes to radical environmentalism, the founder of an organization, Air First, which did use sabotage as one of the means of achieving their ends. So it's controversial, I should say. He did have a lot of respect for Snyder, and he does acknowledge that in his writing, as he does acknowledge the role other authors I've been talking about, like Muir and Austin, played in his thinking. I also mentioned the importance of Edward Abbey, yet another author linked with California, for David Foreman. And Abbey was shaped once again by Jeffers, Huxley, and Steinbeck. So these names keep resurfacing, coming back to us. What may be of interest too is that the most important and powerful slogan of Earth First movement is in defense of Mother Earth. So this Mother Earth image played an important role, and Karla later will probably be addressing also this woman mother metaphor. So female as an earth, or earth as a female, that is used very widely by lots of the authors I'm talking about. But it's not only used in the domain of literature, it's actually used in science too. I'm giving one example, best known, James Lovelock's Gaia Hypothesis, a book that was called Gaia, published by Oxford University Press in 1979, and again having a big impact on the scholarly community, a book that represents the Earth as a self-regulating, basically living entity. What's relevant here especially is that he used the name for his scientific hypothesis, Gaia, on the advice of somebody named William Golding, which I believe is a name that you have come across, the British author of The Lord of the Flies. Why is that important? Is that, yeah, both Golding and Lovelock realized the imaginative potential of the figure of Gaia, something that struck the chord in the scientific community, which uses, of course, usually primary language that is kind of called a neutral, let's say. I don't want to use, of course, derogatory words, but it was interesting to see this term used by by a scientist. So what I want to say here is that what I've presented makes me conclude that what we've just seen maybe described as a distinctive, unique literary tradition within the US literature, because I've also documented that the authors not only knew each other but also inspired each other. And I'm giving you some more examples here concerning the mutual influences there. So Gary Snyder was informed by Mary Austin as well as Muir. Jeffers admired Houston. They were actually neighbors for some time, living both in Carmel. Huxley was friends with Robinson Jeffers. Jeffers lived nearby John Steinbeck and had a very big influence on his early work. And actually, even it was Jeffers who made Steinbeck adopt a non-anthropocentric concept called breaking through the human-centered illusions that are best conveyed in a book that's called To a Good Unknown, one of his first books, I mean, John Steinbeck's books. Snyder made references to all of these writers. And in The Practice of the World, translated into Czech as Praxe divočiny, he describes Austin as a vanguard, like pioneer of non-expansionistic and non-anthropocentric thinking. A woman who was able to hoist the sails that are filling with wind today. Well, as I say, if Austin hoisted the sails, Jeffers filled them with wind, because he was a major influence on Gary Snyder, especially in the first phase of his writing in the 1950s. But Snyder was also influenced by Steinbeck, especially by the sense of place in writings that had to do with California and the West Coast. Here you can see a picture of people whom I could talk about too. On the very left, you can see Gary Snyder at a protest in San Francisco in 1967. Next to him is Michael McClure, another author who wrote about the environment, an important poet, a deep poet, and of course, Allen Ginsberg, whom I believe some of you can recognize. Just briefly about environmental utopia and dystopia. Actually, many authors, acclaimed authors of this genre, have set their stories in California, whose environment has been at greatest danger or peril due to the rapid and uncontrolled growth of the state of California, especially in the post-war periods. And in this connection, Lawrence Buell's quote, Buell is one of the founding fathers of ecocriticism, I think is apt, relevant. Environmental crisis involves the crisis of the imagination. And ecotopian thought, as I say, is the basis for imaginary, as well as real ecotopian communities. So the few selected writers associated with environmental utopia and dystopia that I want to present are Ursula Le Guin, her ambiguous utopia, which is partly utopia, partly dystopia. Ernst Kallenbach, who is the person who coined the word ecotopia that you may know, but it is originally a title of his book about a society, sustainable society, environmentally aware society, whose center is in San Francisco. That's what this SF stands for here. And Kim Stanley Robinson, another well-known poet, another well-known writer associated with one science fiction, but also dystopia as well as utopia. So to wrap it up, these are my conclusions. So what I want to argue for is that literature is potent vehicle for carrying environmentalist messages. I also want to say that the writers that I've been talking about did not only help raise awareness, environmental consciousness, but they also were instrumental in shaping and inspiring movements, so action. The other thing that I'm arguing is that environmental thinkers also acknowledge the importance of the authors I was talking about, because they were able to combine philosophical insights with the facts of science and put them eloquently. And also the imaginative potential and mobilizing effect over a text is another thing that I was trying to document in my presentation. Another thing is the link between the authors, which I call a coherent thread. So mutual inspirations, interrelations, and impacts among the authors that I was talking about. And arguably they represent what I'd call a countercurrent to the anthropocentric literature in the United States. And California was also and is also a very fertile ground for literary visions and as well as ecotopian communities. So that's all I want to say. Thank you for your attention. These are my sources, at least the most important ones. And let me stop sharing and let me introduce yet another speaker, and that is Karla Rohová, our MA student, and also a promising ecofeminist and a poet, and I believe a talented ecocritic. She just completed her MA thesis on environmental racism in the work of Octavia Butler. So environmental racism is one of the issues she will address in her presentation. Ecofeminism is yet another concept that she will come across. So Karla, please go ahead. The screen is yours.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Okay. So hello everyone. Today I would like to share with you my research and presentation, which is called Ecofeminist, Ecocritical Perspective on John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Raw. While the topic of my presentation is John Steinbeck's extraordinary novel published in 1939, The Grapes of Raw, today my goal is to show you a different kind of Steinbeck, or to be exact, I would like to present an analysis of his work through ecocritical as well as ecofeminist lens. And well, I will do my best not to upset the grapes. First of all, I should tell you a few words about ecofeminism. When you say words like Mother Earth, Mother Nature, Virgin Land, or just unconsciously use female pronouns to talk about nature or animals, you actually create jobs for ecofeminists. But jokes aside, if we use such language, we create a connection between nature and women, or between animals and women. Some ecofeminists claim that biologically, women are a tiny little bit closer to nature than men, because women experience biological cycles which already exist in nature. A good example is a reproductive cycle. However, ecofeminists also reveal that this form of connection can offer both empowerment and oppression, both protection and exploitation. This is the moment when ecofeminism as a social, philosophical, activist and critical literary movement comes on stage to help us understand why we use the woman-nature metaphor, why we push women to nurture children while men are pushed to work, especially to work in technical fields, and how does this influence the society's relationship towards nature as well as towards the minorities. And this is Poison Ivy from Batman. You might recognize her. She is thought to be the first ecofeminist action hero. In this regard, Steinbeck offers a genius collection of work, as was already said, and he also creates a lot more work for ecofeminists. If you read any of Steinbeck's books, you will probably notice that he incorporates nature in his stories, and does so in a way that often makes nature almost a character of its own. What is more, Steinbeck is also known for his criticism of a society's destructive behavior towards nature. He would raise awareness about fires in California, deforestation, or mechanization of agriculture many decades before environmentalism even became popular around the world. Steinbeck's novels, such as To a God Unknown, even address deeper ecological issues, and these topics are most discussed in the novel The Log from the Sea of Cortez. When it comes to women in nature, Steinbeck would often use the woman metaphor to describe nature, or more specifically to describe the character's relationship towards nature. In the short text you are now looking at, Steinbeck describes the Californian land as if it was a woman's pregnant body. The full green hills are round and soft as breasts. All California quickens with produce, and the food grows heavy. In this text, Steinbeck uses the woman metaphor to highlight the fertility of Californian land and nature. Such emphasis is important because this way California, green, fertile, full of food products, stands in opposition to Oklahoma and other states affected by the dust bubble, an ecological disaster of the 1930s, which displaced Okies, the Joad family, as well as thousands of others. The dust bubble is a name for an area that was affected by continuous dust storms in the 1930s. We are not talking only about Oklahoma, but also about New Mexico, Colorado, Texas, and Kansas. Eventually, these storms affected the whole United States, and serious legislation concerning soil conservation had to be passed in order to prevent such disasters. These dust storms, as well as the Great Depression, displaced thousands of people as they were unable to grow crops and pay mortgage. And this is how the dust storm would actually look like. This is in Texas. This is how the Joad family would look like in real life. These are real photos of the migrants traveling to California. This is the Coachella Valley, where most of the migrants would work in California. And if you look closely, there are also children visible. They would have to work too, otherwise the family wouldn't be able to survive. And this is a picture of how the land looks like after a dust storm. It is completely empty. It is dead. Steinbeck's disapproval of land appropriation done by banks, such that happened to the Joad family in the novel, is well described in The Grapes of Wrath. In fact, at the beginning of the novel, Steinbeck uses so-called eco-rape to identify the exploitation of nature as rape. The biggest role in the process of raping in this text belongs to the machine, in this case the tractor, which rolled a shining disc, cutting the earth with blades, and functioned as a disconnecting tool between the land and the man. According to Okies, according to Joe family, the tractor is responsible for the loss of their land, which the Okies demonstrate by saying, "I lost my land, a single tractor took my land." However, what can be also understood from this text is that in the case of the discussed eco-rape, women are not even present. To make women absent during an act which in reality is a threat to them is similar to making animals the absent reference in meat industry. This way, when we go to the grocery store, we do not see animals, we only see their meat, which makes it easier for us to excuse mass killing and to keep consuming. And although this is more of an issue discussed in connection to animal studies, ecofeminists connect this issue also to eco-rape, because if women are excluded from illustrations of acts of sexual violence, just like animals are excluded from meat industry, we make it seem as if such violence was common and acceptable. While the connection of Steinbeck's female characters to nature and Mother Earth can be found throughout the novel, it is most prominent in the last part. Rose of Sharon gives birth to a dead child and then uses her mother's milk to feed a dying man. Although in this case the scenario is reversed and life is given not to the newborn baby, but to a grown-up man, the cycle of life is kept alive in Rose of Sharon's sacrifice towards the dying man. However, the archetype of Mother Earth does not concern only Rose of Sharon. Her mother is the Mother Earth of the family and represents the Mother Earth in the novel by always making sure the cycle of life is not torn and giving Rose of Sharon the final push towards her decision to feed the dying man. Having said that, you can also view the roles of Mama Jevd and Rose of Sharon as stereotypical, as if the purpose of women in the novel was mainly to serve food and sustain life for direct or indirect sake of Steinbeck's male characters. What is more, this is Steinbeck's only novel where women take lead, and the only novel which starts with an irreversible ecological disaster and, although decorated with Rose of Sharon's mysterious smile, the novel still ends in an irreversible childbirth and human disaster. In conclusion, Steinbeck uses the female body to demonstrate his critique and accomplishes to connect the ecological struggles with the social struggles of Okies. Undeniably, to read John Steinbeck from an ecofeminist perspective is a journey which does not give the one who walks it clear conclusions. However, it definitely does offer a distinct approach to Steinbeck's novels, as does to his relation to both the land and women. An approach which has a potential to add to the worldwide discussion about the woman-nature relationship as well as its benefit, to the woman-nature relationship as well as its benefits. And thank you very much.
I thank you, Karla, for your presentation and for respecting the time a bit more than me, for sure. My colleague Jan Beneš isn't teaching anymore, and he's ready to present his piece. Jan Beneš may be a familiar face to those of you who watch TV news, because he comments on the latest developments in the United States quite often, on a regular basis, I would even say. In terms of his scholarly work, he specializes in African American literature as well as history, and sometimes with special attention to environmental racism and environmental justice. So yeah, that will be also the kind of angle that he will take in his presentation. So Honza, you can take the screen.
Thank you very much. First of all, hi everyone. Sorry for being late. The second thing is, can everybody hear me properly, clearly?
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you. Si se puede. All right. So let me see if I can figure out how to share my screen, because I kind of forgot how to do this. Why is this not? Oh, I see. So, am I sharing my screen?
Yes, we can see what it is.
And can you see the second slide?
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you very much. So I don't know how to follow three esteemed eco-critics, but here's my piece. So what I want to show you today is what slow violence looks like and how it can inform the concept of slow violence, how it can inform our understanding of environmental racism and perhaps even environmental justice. And I'll show that with the help of a text, The Yellow House, which won the National Book Award 2 years ago. It's a memoir, and Treme, an HBO show about 9 years old, so from almost a decade ago, which takes place right after Katrina in New Orleans. So let me introduce Louisiana to you. You probably know Louisiana as this beautiful place, touristy, very welcoming to tourists, very historical place with parties and rich culture. That's New Orleans. Or you might know Louisiana from these beautiful plantations with, of course, a brutal history, but nonetheless extremely popular tourist destinations where you can even have a wedding today. However, not often do we see images of this kind of Louisiana. Louisiana that is a center of the petrochemical industry in the United States, and that is one of the most heavily polluted areas in the US. One of the most famous areas in Louisiana that's connected to environmental pollution or to pollution and environmental racism is so-called Cancer Valley. It's a heavily industrialized area in Southeast Louisiana. It is populated mostly by African-American and low-income communities. And it is widely infamous for the high pollution levels, especially of toxic air pollution. because some of these plants here, they produce neoprene, and for that you need chloroprene, which is a dangerous pollutant. And so it is in this area that we can see a lot of cancer cases, a lot of respiratory illness cases, and 7 out of the 10 US areas where you see the highest cancer risks in the United States, you will find these in the Cancer Valley. There are, of course, other places across the United States where you can find similar regions, similar pockets. However, Cancer Valley is probably the most famous one and also the most dangerous one. And just to kind of connect it with, what's going on today with the pandemic, this is also an area where you see a huge number of COVID cases because of the combination of the toxic air pollution and so respiratory illnesses. Of course, in general, the water is not great either, and so that combined with COVID with the virus, it makes the population extremely susceptible to not only contracting the virus but also to dying of it. So this is a kind of a clear case of what we could refer to as environmental racism, and it's been called that even by the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights this year. The office describes environmental racism as serious and disproportionate threats to the enjoyment of several human rights. And they're talking about the Cancer Valley. And so they're talking largely about the African-American residents living there. And the rights that are being threatened are the right to equality and non-discrimination, the right to life, the right to health, the right to an adequate standard of living, and cultural rights, of course. Because as the communities kind of die out, their history and their culture also dies out. And so environmental racism is really defined as the various ways that communities of color, especially African Americans, face greater harms from environmental factors. And so in that sense, it's also inseparable from racial and residential segregation, because it is people of color, especially African Americans, but also Hispanics, who are often concentrated in neighborhoods or regions, as I've shown you with Cancer Valley, that have frequently been disempowered. Not only the regions and the areas, but also the populations. And they're disempowered both politically and financially. And what's connected with this, with residential segregation and environmental racism, is that historically, industrial spaces, power plants, factories, high emitters of air pollution, they've been sited, they have been placed in neighborhoods, in areas, in regions where there's typically a low income, typically African American or Hispanic population. And combined with that in Louisiana is the threat almost every season, a threat of a hurricane coming in and adding insult to injury in these Black communities. This is a redlining map of New Orleans, so that's connected to residential segregation. Those areas that are in red, those would be the Black, the African-American areas, and that's where you will find many like waste facilities and plants and various factories in New Orleans. And those are places where, of course, you will find the population quite unhealthy. And so that combines, that kind of gives us an idea of what environmental racism looks like. So let me introduce the concept of slow violence. We typically, as I'm showing you in this GIF, we typically think of violence as something that's immediate and explosive and spectacular. It has this sensational visibility. It is extremely visible, right? Violence is, we immediately recognize what violence looks like, that violence is taking place, it is happening. However, with slow violence, which Rob Nixon introduces in his monograph from 2011, it's a type of violence that occurs gradually. And so because it's gradual, it's also out of sight. It is a violence that destroys with some kind of delay. And that delay is spread across time and space. And so we tend not to see it as violence because it is not that visible, it is not that spectacular. And its principal casualties, its typical victims of slow violence, those are poor people lacking resources. In Louisiana, it's African Americans lacking political and financial power to fight against the petrochemical industry. And they are, because the violence, the slow violence is invisible, so are its victims. They don't count. And in general, when we think of slow violence, we can, according to Nixon, we can think of climate change in general. We can think of the thawing cryosphere, deforestation, the radioactive aftermaths of war. Just think about Chernobyl and how long the consequences of it are still visible, are still manifest themselves. Also, acidifying oceans and other slowly unfolding environmental catastrophes come under the label of slow violence. And so environmental racism is a type of slow violence. And it is also slow because our efforts to mobilize, our efforts to do something about this type of catastrophes, it is slow because we don't see these things unfold. They're slow, our reactions are just as slow as the violence that occurs. And so the question is, when it comes to literature, African-American literature, and to cultural artifacts, is how do we devise stories that will draw attention to slow violence, that is invisible? And how do we come up with images that are adequate to the slowness of this violence? Enters Sarah M. Broom and her The Yellow House from 2019, a powerful autobiography of not just her, but also of her family, and a biography of what it was like growing up in New Orleans. Now, Broom introduces this new part of New Orleans called the East New Orleans. Here's the vision. This is from the 1950s. This is when her grandmother is living in the city. So back in 1959, there's a plan for the New Orleans East Incorporated to kind of come up with and build and develop an entire new neighborhood. And it was expected to surpass anything that has been done in the past. This is supposed to make New Orleans a booming, prosperous, and proud place. The New York Times, they claim that a city within a city is rising in the South. So rising, so clearly this is progress. It is called East New Orleans, it is called a model city. And it will take form within an old and glamorous one. And if successful, it will have made New Orleans the brightest spot in the South, the envy of every land-shy community in America. And so Broom's grandmother invests in a house in this community. It costs $3,200, and she becomes the first in her immediate family to own a house. An unbelievable, a fulfillment of an unbelievable dream for many African Americans, especially in the 1950s. However, we find out that nothing about the dream of New Orleans really comes to pass. And in its design, there are more apartments and trailer parks built than houses, which in the United States, this implies multiple member family housing. Apartments mean low income, it means more family members rather than houses. Trailer parks, low income rather than middle class or upper middle class. And she says there were more street lights than trees and parks, more paved roads than walkways. And so certain parts of the East were best driven through. This is a landscape that communicates feeling, and the feeling is that this is not necessarily a place to live. So the dreams are not really coming through. And the place is being East New Orleans is being developed, or slowly, gradually turns into an almost uninhabitable space. The Red Barn on the corner where they used to play in the 50s and the early 1960s, before Hurricane Betsy hits the city. The Red Barn where they played Nancy Sinatra's These Boots Are Made for Walking, that turns into the Ebony Barn. And that serves a new clientele as more African Americans are pushed into East New Orleans, which is not being developed anymore. Instead, construction begins on a new public housing project. Public housing project means low income African Americans. And Broom's grandfather actually warns that this is an experiment that will bring residents from several different downtown housing projects. So downtown, the area that I showed you in the first pictures, the touristy area that is supposed to be displayed to tourists and to investors. People, the unwanted people are moved out of it and pushed into East New Orleans. And Simon Broom, Sarah's grandfather, says that these public housing projects, they will infest everything around. Because he remembers how another public project like this, Press Park, had been built on top of the agricultural street landfill, 95 acres and 17 feet of cancer-causing waste. So the area is not really being developed. Instead, the poor population, especially the Black population, is being pushed into it. And what's being built is these public housing projects only for low-income people, and on sites that are not made for construction of residential areas, for residential buildings. And so by the late 1970s, the racial composition of the East had flipped. Within 20 years from that great idea that the city, rising within a city, the area had gone from mostly empty initially to mostly white, which brought investment, to mostly Black, which meant divestment. And so everything in the East, says Sarah Broom, is slipping. It turns into stasis, into entropy, into full-blown disrepair. There are empty apartment buildings, and they turn into subsidized housing for poor Black people. And friends of hers tell her that if you pull out your map of the city of New Orleans, you will have noticed that a good portion of New Orleans East is not even there at all. It just, because of its population, because of who's being pushed into it, it disappears as part of New Orleans. And as it disappears, that's why those same populations are pushed into it. And so finally, the area really turns from a residential area into an industrial one. The end of the street, a whole members of its own body, says Sarah Broom. The land that had been Oak Haven Trailer Park is now bare and is used for illegal dumping, which later on becomes an official business. And she says the junk starts winning. The short end of Wilson Street had become more industrial than residential. The view from our windows changed. A solid fence of salvaged sheet metal rose up around the junk, blocking one terrible view with another. And the houses are hapless bystanders. So towards the end of her memoir, Sarah Broom says, I'm trying to figure out how a residential neighborhood became an industrial one with a predominantly African-American population, or rather why that was meant for the residential neighborhood, once the Black people started moving in, became an industrial neighborhood. Now, Treme is a different part of the city of New Orleans. And HBO decided to do a show in the early 2010s on the aftermath of Katrina in that neighborhood. Treme is sometimes referred to as the oldest African-American neighborhood in America. It's also the birthplace of jazz. And it will kind of add some visuals to the story that Sarah Broom offers of New Orleans, environmental racism and slow violence. Let me start with this. This is Claiborne Avenue, the longest continuous line. This is from Broom. She says this was the longest continuous line of oaks to be found anywhere in America in the 1950s. Look at that beautiful avenue. And it used to be a thriving Black community and a Black shopping district with tailors and clothing stores and restaurants. But in the 1950s, 150 homes were grazed, as were the oaks. When New Orleans and Louisiana, and the state of Louisiana, were deciding where the highway would go, they decided it would go through the Black neighborhood, the historical Black neighborhood, with a beautiful avenue with oaks. And this is what they would build instead. This is what it looks like today. So instead of that beautiful park, instead of green spaces, you have the industrial use of that space. Instead of a residential area, it turns into an industrial one. It's a slow process, and it is a violent process that displaces African Americans from their historical neighborhoods. And of course, when Katrina hits in 2005, that doesn't help. Katrina really makes Treme go from bad to worse. 80% of New Orleans is flooded. The floodwaters don't recede for weeks. There's around, the number is an approximation, almost 2,000 dead people. 1 million in the entire region are displaced, not just Louisiana, but also Mississippi and Alabama. 350,000 cars are swept away. And there's 80 million cubic meters of debris, which is 10 times worse than what was in 9/11. You can imagine how much toxic waste there must have been. And in the aftermath of Katrina, the costs of housing go up. Even in those Black neighborhoods, those Black people are displaced and they can't come back because it's too expensive. And it's also toxic. Public housing options become less available than before. And so thousands of residents, mostly African American, are permanently displaced. And so this shows, again, they are replaced with new landfills, with new construction, or with new divestment from Black communities. They're abandoned. Those areas are abandoned, too toxic to return to. This is what it looks like under that highway after Katrina, with all these cars kind of swept under the highway. And this is where Treme, in its first episode, kind of comes in. A second line festival is taking place where the neighborhood kind of gets together with artists and musicians, and they walk around the neighborhood and they celebrate the coming of spring. And at one point in the first episode, they come under that highway that I just showed you on Claiborne Avenue in Treme. And you see the slow violence of those disintegrating cars. This is 3 months after Katrina. This is what the community has to live with and live inside of. So you see the history of the community and the community trying to celebrate and protect and preserve its history, but they also know that what's happening is the industrialization of their neighborhood and the toxic waste that nobody's going to take care of, nobody's going to take away from their neighborhood. And so this is a pretty brutal, violent image of course, celebration, but at the same time, the neighborhood disintegrating and having its issues after Katrina, or Katrina making worse what was already pretty bad before that. Now, to end on a positive note, Treme, although it's not the most entertaining show you will find, it is a pretty beautiful and rich, it beautifully and richly captures what life is like in Treme. But it also tells an undertold political history of New Orleans after Katrina, a story of federal neglect of the Black neighborhoods, of local malfeasance, continuous corruption, and of course, environmental racism that is always in the background and many times in the forefront. And it gives kind of texture and context to the violence, not necessarily the fast and spectacular violence, but the slow violence that is the inevitable aftermath of not just a broken system politically and historically, but an environmental catastrophe that turned a poor neighborhood, an environmentally neglected and destroyed neighborhood to a much worse one. That's all. That's it for me. I don't have a slide that says thank you, but thank you.
Never mind, the slide is not there. So I thank you for your presentation that has offered yet another perspective on the environment in the US context. And it should also be said that environmental racism and environmental justice that you addressed in your presentation is one of the top priorities of the new president of the United States, Joe Biden, who is addressing related issues in the American society. But I'm also delighted to say that it may well become a top priority for the English department and for all the presenters, because we are about to submit a grant proposal whose tentative title is A Critique of Environmental Injustice in Ethnic American Literatures. And all the people you have heard in the past hour or so are part of the team. So that might be of interest. I think what's not quite fair here is that the two male speakers took most of the time, obviously. So I think after we are done with the questions, and I'm glad to see one from Romania, I got a question for our colleagues for Parisa and Karla, but we'll first definitely address the questions that I see in the chat box. So let me read that. Have the New Orleans, Louisiana authorities implemented any measures for reducing the negative effect of industry pollution? Is there any will to shut down the petrochemical industry or move it further away from the city? So that's obviously a question for Beneš.
Of course, the petrochemical industry is extremely important for Louisiana. The state's not going to go against its greatest employer, right, or employer of people from Louisiana and even the neighboring states. So the opposition to the petrochemical industry is mostly grassroots. It's non-governmental, non-profit organizations. They did manage, I mean, here and there, there's enough pressure for some of these companies to stop maybe building a new plant or establishing a new plant or expanding their old plants in the Cancer Valley. But as soon as that pressure kind of subsides, they either move it somewhere else, but still pretty close, because the Cancer Valley is really close to the main kind of the artery of Louisiana, the highway that cuts across it. So it's really it's a great space for industry. But no, the petrochemical industry is unbelievably strong in Louisiana, and it's a really poor state, so it needs the money, it needs the taxes that it collects from these industries. But actually, Karla can even tell you a little bit more, because she took part in several, how should I put it, events, or I mean, she was active in New Orleans when she was there in the environmental justice movement.
Yeah, well, what I can say is that activism, especially grassroots activism in New Orleans, is really wildly popular. Practically every citizen is interested in all the council hearings that talk about the industries that are developing in the city. And in lots of the parishes around the Lake Pontchartrain, the people are actually winning. For instance, the Hellis oil company, they actually lost against citizens in the St. Tammany parish, where I was actually residing. But then on the other hand, we cannot say the same for the communities that live in the Cancer Valley. They're losing all the time, and it really depends on the future if it changes or not. Even yesterday, I read an article that they are now passing more permits for the industries to go far and further into the city, and the people are afraid that they will lose their jobs because the city becomes unpopular for people, unpopular for the fishing industry, etc.
All right, thank you for both responses. Thanks are also coming from Romania, from Nikolai. So thank you for the question, Nikolai. And once again, let me invite other questions. We are really open and eager to take questions, so don't hesitate, don't be afraid. We are here to answer whatever questions you have.
I take it personally because people left while I was talking. You know, so I just killed it off.
No, not too many people have left. I got a question for ladies. That's a simple one, because as some of you may know, ecocriticism and environmental humanities don't represent really thriving fields at Czech academia and in literary scholarship, literary studies. So, of course, the question is, how did you get interested in this particular field, be it ecocriticism or ecofeminism? So may I ask Parisa Changizi first? Let me just repeat it. Parisa, I mean, is doing her PhD in Ostrava. She's been living in the Czech Republic for 4 years almost now, but she comes from Iran. That's where her first PhD comes from. That's where she actually got interested in ecocriticism. How did it happen, Parisa?
Well, that's an interesting question. Well, it was a long time ago. I was much younger, I guess. But as you said, that ecocriticism is not the thing in Czech Republic. I would say that at the time, which was like probably around 2013, 14, ecocriticism was not very well known in Iran either. But obviously I was at the university, so one of the professors mentioned it in class. So I did a little bit of research, and what I found was that I found a professor in the United States, Professor Ken Hiltner. So, and he was doing some podcast on, environment and the relationship between environment and literature. And I think that it was just a course, like the sessions were like about 10 sessions, not more than that. And he was obviously sharing his presentation. So I actually downloaded all of them, and that's how I actually was introduced into the field. And basically, the more I did the research, the more I became interested in the field. And obviously, I thought that it was quite topical because 21st century has been dubbed the century of the environment. And I do remember that a few years back, perhaps like I don't know, less than 10 years back. People were arguing that the 21st century was the century of race and the 21st century is the century of environment. Nowadays, the climate is a little bit different and everything has merged, even like as we discussed today, environmental racism. The lines are not that clear cut, but back then it was like, that's the thing to do. And it seems that it is. And now people have like progress to basically bring all the disciplines together, and they have a more complex, I would say, area to study. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. By the way, what's the status of ecocriticism in Iran, in your home country?
Well, I do believe that nowadays more people are interested. I have been contacted by people from inside of Iran, people who are interested. And I actually came across some studies that have been done in Persian, like the language. And it's not just that people at the English department who are like interested. People who are doing actually Persian literature at the Persian department also seem to be a little bit interested. And also, it seems that in terms of fiction and novels, many writers who are doing adolescent fiction are becoming more and more interested in like environmental issues. And it seems that there is this sort of impetus, I would say, to introduce people at a young age to environmental issues. So I think that there is that. And I mean, in terms of the environmental problems that we have in Iran, it's really important because we're not doing that great. And so I think that people are becoming more and more aware, and people are more and more interested, especially the younger generation. So I'm very hopeful.
That's good to hear. Thank you. The same question goes to Karla concerning the origins of her interest in ecofeminism, ecocriticism.
Well, I come from the Moravian Silesian region. I come from Karviná. That's where I was born and raised. And being raised in a very industrial area and very environmentally degraded area, destroyed area, I would always try to look for nature and to look for the natural landscape and kind of to find my own healing in there, because I felt like there was something missing in my life. And that's where I came to literature, especially to literature of John Steinbeck, that my mother introduced me to. And when I read his words about nature, about the environment, that was something that I really fell in love with and felt very connected to, because that's the kind of nature that I would always miss in my life. and I found it in his literature, and then in literature of many others. Right now I'm doing African American female writers, and for example Zora Neale Hurston, her books the same, and they even explore more intimate issues when it comes to natural trauma and such. So I'm actually finding and searching for ways and for things that I felt all my life growing up here in the middle of industry, and never had the name for that. And thanks to ecocriticism and ecofeminism, I can finally understand that, and that's amazing. And I want to use that to actually help change this place.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Thanks a lot. Let me just remind you what I said at the very start, and that is the chat box is not the only channel through which you can communicate your questions. You can simply raise your hand, or feel free just to switch on your camera and ask your question or questions. That's another way of doing it. You can go ahead. All right. Seems there are no more questions. So do my colleagues have any questions that they want to ask one of the or two of the members of the panel? We haven't practiced these questions. We expected some from the participants, but maybe we really overwhelmed you with the information in the 4 separate presentations. All right, so I guess we will not steal more of your precious time, but it remains just to thank the speakers. So thank you, Parisa, Changizi, thank you, Karla, Rohová, thank you, Beneš. Thanks to those who helped. Kopecký, all right, I thought that you were about to ask a question. So thanks also go to the organizers from the rector's office, and to all of you who reserved their time and spent the 90 minutes with us. I should also tell you that this is not the last event that's associated with the climate walk organized by the University of Ostrava. The next you can expect just in a week, and that will be actually conducted by our colleagues, especially from the Department of Czech Literature. Professor Malova will be in charge of that. So they will address similar issues from a slightly different perspective, focusing especially on Czech literature, and it will be held on Earth Day. Earth Day that was actually proposed in 1969 in San Francisco, by the way. So Earth Day is, I think, is a good time to talk about the landscape and the environment in literature. So if you are interested, stay tuned and join us in a week. So thank you for your time, and I wish you all the best. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye.